One of my favorite things about the Magic community has always been the different factions of players. You got your aggro players, your control players, your combo players, and of course, huddled together in a far corner of the lunchroom, the mill players. Mill players have always been particularly interesting to me because they represent a mindset important to any community. They can't be satisfied with the status quo. Even though their favorite win condition is often ill-advised or even laughed at, they continue to fight the good fight. They are the dreamers of our community, and they have had short periods of vindication. They remember the glory days of Millstone, or they've ramped into a game-ending brain geyser on the kitchen table. They've even had a few competitive moments in the sun, like the Mind's Desire deck that would brain freeze the opponent to death, but this was really short-lived, as so many of a Mill player's most precious moments are. Last season, there was the infamous Esper control deck whose only win condition was tucking their own Teferi over and over, ensuring that their opponent would eventually run out of cards hours later. But decks like this and the Mind's Desire decks weren't actually dedicated mill decks in any way, so there just haven't been very many periods throughout Magic's history during which cards that actually say, target player puts the top X or Y cards of their library into their graveyard, unquote, have been viable. This has led to a situation where, when new mill cards are printed or we enter a format where mill is strong, most Magic players don't take note, which leads to a self-fulfilling prophecy that mill is always bad. I think you could easily make an argument that we're in just such a format right now, where mill could actually work. Oko is no problem for a deck that doesn't care about life totals, can block Elks and Nissa lands all day, and doesn't have any good creatures for that last ability to steal. Mill is also strong against a few builds that are experiencing a resurgence right now, Azorius Control and Temur Reclamation, as Mill is always known to smash control decks that lack a piece like Elixir of Immortality, and similarly it's good against slow roll combo ramp decks like Reclamation. Exactly like Reclamation, as a matter of fact. So for the first time in a long time, there's actually a good argument for mill, and today, I'm here to make it. Alright, real quick, just before we get started, I want to get this out of the way. All of the outlets in the back half of my house just suddenly stopped working, so I don't have access to my office or all of my neat, fun stuff. So we're going to try something a little bit different today. Let me know if you like it. Also, remember to like the video, do that stuff. But anyway, to get started, I want you to lean in real close. Get real close here. Okay, gotta tell you a secret. A drowned secret, the most disturbing kind. Now I know that it sounds weird to tell you to take mill seriously and then lead on drowned secrets of all cards, but I actually think that this isn't too bad right now, even against some aggro decks that'll waste their second turn playing Cavalcade of Calamity. We can just waste our second turn playing drowned secrets, and there's really not that much tempo lost there. Plus, if a deck does end up playing Oko on turn 2 off their Gilded Goose, for instance, again, we don't care a dry fart about that card, and we will end up taking our second turn off to play drowned secrets, and again, not really lose much tempo in that situation. Now, there are very, very few cards in our deck that aren't blue, so Drowned Secrets is going to trigger on nearly every single spell that we cast as the game goes on, and we've got plenty of relatively low-cost spells in the deck to double and triple spell on some turns, and really get a lot of juice out of Drowned Secrets, especially if we can get multiple copies in play. Now, among those low-cost cards, we go from Secrets to Secret Keeper, Merfolk Secret Keeper, and Wall of Lost Thoughts, too, which I will always read as Wall of Lost Thoughts, T-H-O-T-S. Now, I know what you're thinking. First Drowned Secrets, and now these two cards, and Dev, you really want us to take this deck seriously? And yeah, I do right now. These both block Nissa lands and Elks in these Oko decks, and that's important, but they block a bunch of creatures in the Cavalcade and other aggro decks, for that matter. Now, they're not going to block 10th Street Dodgers or Ginger Brutes, and Scorch Spitters can still deal some damage to you, but for the most part, these are going to block just about every important aggro creature in the format, and can even be decent at blocking well into the late game. But moving along in the mill category in this deck, we're also playing two main deck copies of Ashiok Dreamrender that I think we have to play, but I don't want to go above 2 in the main deck. Very often in these Dimir control style mill decks in Throne of Eldraine Standard, you'll see folks relegate this completely to the sideboard, and I think that might be a mistake. The card is obviously very good for milling purposes, and it also has the tertiary effect of bricking $20 Fabled Passages, which I think is really, really nice. And there's a couple of other cards that people might use to search their library that this will also blank, so that can be nice. That said, it is a bit asynergistic with cards like Drown in the Loch and Into the Story, both of which are cards that are in our deck, but clash a little bit with the fact that Ashiok will exile your opponent's graveyard. That said, in most games, especially games where we need to set up this turn sequence, it's very easy to hold off on Ashiok until you can get a Merfolk Secret Keeper to fuel a Drown in the Loch, actually counter a spell or kill an important creature, and then drop your Ashiok. Drown in the Loch is more or less one of the most insane cards that we could possibly have access to in a mill deck, period, in any format, so I do want to play 4 copies of it, and even though, again, Ashiok is a bit asynergistic here, I still think that both of these cards are too powerful for what we're trying to do not to show up in the main deck, and they don't step on each other's toes nearly as often as you'd think. As far as Into the Story goes, this is amazing whether you're casting it for the full cost in the late game after you've wiped your opponent's graveyard with Ashiok, or you're actually getting to cast it at instant speed, EOT, for 4 mana before you've exiled your opponent's yard with an Ashiok. The card is fine in either situation because a refill is exactly what a deck like this needs, especially if you've got a copy or 2 of Drowned Secrets out and you draw 2 or 3 blue cards. This can often signal defeat right then and there for the opponent. Now, the last card we're playing in the deck that actually mills the opponent is Enter the God Eternals, but this will actually segue and dovetail nicely with all the other removal that we're playing. I've already shown you Drown in the Loch, but there's also Tyrant Scorn and Murderous Rider just to kind of get started here. These will take out a wide variety of creatures and planeswalkers, which are both permanent types that we want to be able to deal with. We struggle sometimes against aggro decks, even though we have cards like Secret Keeper and Wall of Lost Thoughts to block those early creatures. It's always nice to have Tyrant Scorn to take out creatures at instant speed, and same thing goes with cards like Murderous Rider. If they do resolve an Oko and it becomes a problem, or a Nissa and it becomes a problem, or any other planeswalker in their format for that matter, it's really nice to have Murderous Rider. And another cool thing about this is that some turns you can actually cast it out of exile after you've cast the adventure half, and sometimes start gaining life back, or maybe block a creature and effectively gain 2 life back. Now remember that Tyrant Scorn can return your creatures to your hand too, so you can get a Merfolk Secret Keeper or a Wall of Lost Thoughts back into your hand, or even a Murderous Rider, and just repeat those ETB triggers or the adventure half of Murderous Rider again. And sometimes that's going to be really important, especially in matchups where you don't really care about using this as a removal piece. So do keep that in mind. That's an ancillary mode on Tyrant Scorn that can be easily overlooked, but is really important in this deck, especially if you've got 2 Drowned Secrets out. Just Tyrant Scorn and Merfolk Secret Keeper back to your hand, and suddenly you're milling them for 6. And a real quick note on Enter the God Eternals, I feel like this is an answer to Questing Beast that was printed well before Questing Beast. This has the effect of gaining you back the life that you lost from Questing Beast attacking you in the first place, so it's like it didn't have haste. You kill the Questing Beast because it kills a creature with 4 toughness or less, and you get a 4/4 to block a future Questing Beast plus a mill for your mill deck. Just everything about this is sweet, and that's only against Questing Beast. This just does a lot of work against all kinds of creatures in this format right now. But just a few more cards to finish the main deck up here. We're playing 4 copies of Thought Erasure because we're in Dimir colors and we're kind of a control deck, and this card is back around to being one of the best cards in the format now that Field of the Dead is banned. Obviously wasn't great against Field because it can't nab Field or the various lands that deck likes to play, but now that Field is dead and gone, this card is wonderful again because it's just going to break up strategies like Fires of Invention, for instance, or on the play nab that Oko that they wanted to play on turn 2 or 3. That's really important a lot of the time, but it can also get Nissas out of their hand and all kinds of other important garbage. So Thought Erasure is just incredible, and the fact that it fixes your next draw is nice too. So play the 4 copies of Thought Erasure again. I think it's back around to being one of the most viable cards in the entire format, especially if you're in this color combination. But we're also playing a couple of copies of Ritual of Soot just to finish off all of the removal and disruption in the deck, This is just effectively a get-out-of-jail-free button against the Cavalcade decks and any other aggro deck that you might be playing against. And even though I think you might be able to slot in something like Cry of the Carnarium or even Witch's Vengeance over a card like this, Ritual is probably the thing that's going to nab the most creatures the highest percentage of the time. And finally, to finish things up here in the main, 2 copies of Liliana Dreadhorde General. Now, I'm playing this because we're trying to go late into the game anyway. Mill is not going to be able to finish the game off on turn 4, or 5 even, in the current standard with the tools that we have access to right now. So we need to play like a control deck, and a control deck's going to go late into the game anyway. We have plenty of mana to cast Liliana. We might as well have an alternate win condition. We can just win the game in the traditional way by establishing control over the board, turning the corner and playing that Liliana, winning off of zombies. But this also generates blockers that generate cards when they do chump block, and it's another removal piece. Plus, if it ever ultimates, it's going to win the game that way too. Just, we have the slots for Liliana, and we need a sort of emergency out, a plan, just in case there's no way milling them is going to work, and Liliana's great for that too. Now here are the lands in the deck, 25 in all, 18 blue sources and 15 black sources. We do need double black for cards like Murderous Rider and Liliana, and we want to be able to turn on cards like Thought Erasure and Drown in the Lock as early as turn 2. Yeah, you want Drown in the Lock on turn 2 because you're going to be Secret Keepering on turn 1 a great deal of the time, and that turns Drown in the Lock into one of the best counter spells and removal spells in the entire format. But you got to have the black mana for it. So 15 black sources seems a bit much, but trust me, you're going to want it in the end. Plus, we still have 18 blue sources altogether to make sure that we have the blue sources that we need. That's plenty. A quick look at the board reveals some of the best sideboard cards in all of Standard. We've got Ether Gust and Noxious Grasp to deal with a variety of decks, but these are just two of the best sideboard cards in Standard right now, period. And their price in some ways reflects that, especially Noxious Grasp, which is basically a $2 uncommon right now that's slipping into main decks, and could even be in this main deck right now, depending on what tier of arena that you're on, or how competitive your F&M is, for that matter. If everyone is on the Oko decks, then Noxious Grasp almost certainly goes in the main deck, but as it stands, it's just the best sideboard card in the entire format. But that's not where incredible 2-mana cards in, because we also get Negate and Legions in. Legions in, great against not only tokens, if you have to take out a bunch of them at one time, but also problem 1 and 2 mana creatures in the format, which there are actually kind of a great deal of at the moment, especially when you're dealing with a lot of different aggro decks like Cavalcade of Calamity. This can be very good, even in a post-Field of the Dead format, so I'm popping in 1 copy. There are 2 Cry of the Chronarium in the board for when we know that we're dealing with small ball decks like Cavalcade, and especially on the arena ladders, you'll sometimes come across these decks that are aggro decks that care about the graveyard like Aristocrats or whatever, and these can be really good against those decks. Or the decks that play Judith, for instance. You know, they don't get Dies triggers, and they're not able to bring their Gutter Bones back or whatever. So sometimes Cry can be great against those decks, but it's particularly good right now as a low curve sweeper against these Cavalcade decks, and that's important to have. There's also an Elder spell in here because, you know, we want to bust up Planeswalkers, and for that matter, put more, loyalty counters on our Ashiok. That can be important too. But there's also a couple of copies of Mystical Dispute, good against the Oko decks, but pretty much good against anything that plays blue. And to finish it off, there's 1 copy of Callous Dismissal, mostly because of the words non-land permanent, and that allows us to take out, problem permanent types like enchantments, for instance, where we otherwise don't have a good option. You could use Brazen Borrower in this slot, but Callous Dismissal costs a whole lot less, and actually gives us a creature that can block stuff that doesn't fly. So that's kind of good. I think I'll take this, especially against the Cavalcade decks, where this will pop a Cavalcade back to their hand and creates a blocker that can kill a Scorch Spitter, for instance. Now, before I show you a little bit of gameplay for the deck, here are your power rankings right here. Final score of Nintendo 64, which is actually pretty decent for a mill deck in this format, especially one that doesn't actually cost too much outside of the lands and the Lilianas, both of which are cards that you don't necessarily have to play in this deck. You don't want the Lilianas, just add in Ashioks or more Tyrant Scorns or whatever you want to do. It's not too hard to fill those slots with like a 4th Wall of Lost Thoughts or whatever, so you can build this deck on a decent budget, but I decided to try and go all out as much as I could, but that really only led to, adding Liliana and Watery Grave. It doesn't really lead to that much extra expense. And the deck actually functions as a pretty decent Dimir control deck right now. And there are even cards I didn't play that you might consider, things like Lockmere Serpent as an alternate win condition, or even Revenge of Ravens in the sideboard as an option against decks like Cavalcade of Calamity. There's also things, for instance, like Command the Dreadhorde, that would allow you to not only get stuff out of your opponent's graveyard as an alternate win condition, but get back things like Wall of Lost Thoughts to repeat those enter the battlefield triggers. So there are ideas I didn't incorporate here, but all in all, I think this is one of the cleanest ways to build a hybrid control and mill deck in these colors right now. Now I've got 2 games to show you today. This first one is against what appears to be a 4-color Elementals build that's trying to get value off of things like Risen Reef and even Yarok, and that's a pretty exciting deck. It plays Scampering, Scorcher, and all that, but it's very much a creature-based deck, so I wanted to give you an example of how this deck plays against decks like that, because usually that's what we are at our weakest against. Now we start the game here by having the mulligan, and our opponent gets a little bit of ramp on us, but you'll see in the end that it doesn't actually eventually end up mattering. We get Merfolk Secret Keeper, and now, starting next turn, Drown in the Loch will be completely online as either a counterspell or a decent removal spell. Now on this turn, our opponent is going to get Overgrowth Elemental. Now, at this point, we can play Dismal Backwater, gain a life, and we've still got both Murderous Rider and Drown in the Loch up, so let's see what happens. Now what you saw there was me considering casting a Drown in the Loch on the Overgrowth Elemental in response to them casting the Yarok, but instead I decided let's let the Yarok resolve and then go ahead and beat it with the Murderous Rider to get that out of the way. At this point on the next turn, we can play Drown Secrets and still have room in, mana-wise to play a card like Drown in the Loch, which we did there and killed their Overgrowth Elemental. Then we can just Ritual of Soot their board away. They only have 2 cards left in their hand, and we can start taking control. Whatever they play, we can just enter the God Eternals or Murderous Rider, and the entire time we're getting Drown Secrets triggers. Alright, see, it's turns like that this deck lives for. What we're able to do there is get multiple Drown Secrets triggers in the same turn, a Merfolk Secret Keeper, and we're able to play Murderous Rider out of the graveyard and attack with it on an empty board and gain a couple of life back, thus sustaining ourselves a little bit for the rest of the game. At this point, our opponent gets Scampering Scorcher, but it's not a big deal because we've got 2 Merfolk Secret Keepers up to block, and we've just gained a little bit of life, meaning it's going to take forever for them to actually get damage through with Scorchers. And then our worst nightmare happens. Our opponent actually resolves a Jace, Wielder of Mysteries, but because we saved that Murderous Rider in our hand, we are able to deal with it, wipe the sweat from our brow, and say go. Now it's late in the game now, and our opponent is starting to fill their board, but so are we. We can profitably block, or at least stop, just about everything on the table right now. So you see what happens is, once we get a little bit later on into the game, we're able to build up a board state, we can actually suppress other board states really, really well with just a few creatures. A lifelinking Murderous Rider and a couple of 0/4s can do a lot more for you to hold down your side of the board than you might think. It's a little bit later in the game, and we've dropped our second Drown Secrets. We've gotten an Enter the God Eternals off of a Castle Locthwain. Again, a very important card Locthwain is for generating that card advantage and making sure that we can keep the gas on in the late game. At that point, that's 6 mills, 4 life, and we got rid of their best creature. Now, they have no cards in their library. That's the end of the story. Now this next matchup is against a red-white deck that's mostly playing just aggro-y creatures. It sort of feels like one of the Feather decks, but it never actually got a copy of Feather onto the table. That said, through some good play in this game, we're able to suppress this aggro deck very, very well and actually come away with a win due to Liliana. Oh, and note there, by the way, how good Drown in the Loch can be in the early game so long as you've gotten a Merfolk Secret Keeper on the turn before it. Our opponent's simply trying to do as much damage to us as quickly as possible in this game, in the early turns at least, and that's what we see here. We played a Murderous Rider to make sure that we can block profitably and gain a little bit of life to stay in the game long enough to actually get to this Ritual of Soot. Now at this point, our opponent is really putting the pressure on with a Hasty Tajik and a Mentor trigger. We're going to go down to 4, and as a matter of fact, we're going to go down to 1 at some point in this game, but this Fabled Passage allows us to Ritual of Soot and completely stabilize. See, this is the point at which a card like Into the Story is a very, very good Magic card. We've got a couple of mana up, that way if they play a creature we can Tyrant Scorn, but instead they're going to say go, and we get to draw 4 cards for effectively free because we untap immediately afterwards. Now, it's safe to play Drowned Secrets because we still have Tyrant Scorn up at this point. We can take care of pretty much any creature that they might deign to play, but our opponent is still drawing blank at this point. We have all the mana in the world. We decide that there's pretty much no way the opponent's going to be able to turn the game around if we resolve this Liliana, and that's exactly how things go down. Our opponent uses the intervention to put us at 1, and yes, there is a bit of a misplay here. I probably should have attacked with this zombie token, but it really doesn't matter. I don't care about my opponent's life total too much when I'm playing with this deck, but we were able to enter the God Eternals our own zombie token to make sure that we don't die if our opponent draws another integrity intervention, or say a Skewer the Critics, or we don't know what they're playing on the next turn. They then good game us and scoop to the Liliana. Now, the reason I showed those 2 games specifically is because those are games against what are effectively aggro decks in which we actually win quite handily and don't lose that much control over either game, although we do go down to very low life totals in both of them. We are able to stabilize and end the game by milling our opponent out of cards. So if that's not a good indicator that the deck actually works, I don't know what else is. So let me know how you felt about this one down there in the sideboard, the comments section. And, of course, anything that I missed, any secret tech that you might know about the deck that we all need to know, make sure you comment it down there. Like the video, share it around if more people need to know the truth about Mill right now in this format. And, of course, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done that yet. Trying to get to 120,000. I'd really like to do that. Also, check out the Patreon if you haven't done that yet. Patreon.com/SBMTG to support content like this. For whatever reason, YouTube didn't let me monetize my last video, and I don't know why, so we'll see if they let me monetize this one. If they don't, I really kind of need your Patreon support, so ain't too proud to beg. Get in there, link in the description. But aside from that, there's also links to other stuff we've done recently, like the Blue-Black Flash gameplay that we did. We went 4-1. Make sure to check that one out if you want another strong Dimir deck in the standard right now. But in any case, I'm done for this one. Get at me down there in the comments section. Let me know how you felt, and I will catch you cats later. I'm Deb from the place. Thanks for watching, my wizards. Spread love and be kind. Now here's all my $10 Patreon peoples that have already signed up for the Patreon and help me live my dream every day. I just want to say thank you, especially this video, to Lucas Little Thunder. Hope you're there in the audience. Lucas, you're cool. Your name makes me think of Lucas from like the Mother series, Earthbound. Maybe your name is just Lucas, but I'm thinking about like Lucas from Smash Brothers is how most people probably know that character, and that's really sad. But if you haven't played Mother, it's just like the spiritual predecessor to the Earthbound games. They're really, really good. So play those if you haven't, Lucas. But either way, I just appreciate you being a Patreon person. You're sweet. And just so you know, everybody, Blue Black Mill, first deck that Lucas Little Thunder ever tried to build. So I hope that we've helped you out, Lucas, in making your Dimir Mill deck even better. So, or at least, you know, helping you relive nostalgic moments of your Dimir Mill greatness. That's what Mill players like, as we discussed at the beginning of the video. Brought it back around. But anyway, I'm pretty sure all my patrons have gone by, and I'm just babbling at this point. So I'll see you later. Bye.